outside is frightful, but the fire is so delightful. And since we've no place to go, let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. Man, it doesn't show signs of stopping, and I brought me some corn for popping. The lights are turned way down low. The lights are turned way down low. The lights are turned way down low. The lights are turned way down low.
Some of the major developments we're following on this Monday. More than 11.4 million cases of coronavirus that we know of around the world. At least 534,000 deaths as more than 6.1 million recover.
The Labor Department is out with jaw-dropping new numbers.
Unemployment claims skyrocketing, with 6.6 million people filing in the last week alone.
It's still 1.5 million. It's still an enormous number.
The UK has fallen into its largest recession on record because of the coronavirus lockdown, contracting by more than 20% between April and June in the biggest slump of any major global economy. The recession, defined by 6 months in a row of falling output, is the first since the 2008 financial crash.
Tonight, the U.S. is tracking North Korea's every move after new satellite images were released that could indicate the North is stepping up its production of long-range missiles, which could potentially reach the U.S. mainland.
Surely you've got a bit more respect than that. I'm trying to reason with you, Joe.
I get it.
Fine.
I get it.
Fine. But I am not here to show an idiot you can't put f***ing raw onions in an onion soup. I can't teach you that. That's called common sense. That in your tiny mind is not common.
Brace for more cases. That's the warning from the New South Wales Premier as the nation battles this new COVID nightmare. Christmas has been ruined for millions across the country.
We need inspiration. What inspires you? Is it music? Your faith? I believe the greatest inspiration comes from the courage of others. On February 7th, 1919, Desmond Doss was born in Virginia. His mother raised him as a devout Christian and instilled Sabbath keeping and nonviolence. During World War II, he chose military service, despite being offered a deferment. Doss refused to kill an enemy soldier or carry a weapon into combat because of his personal beliefs as a Christian. He consequently became a medic, assigned to the 2nd Platoon, 1st Battalion. Doss was beaten by his own men, who tormented him and called him a traitor and a coward for his beliefs. During the Battle of Okinawa, he saved the lives of 75 wounded soldiers on top of an area known as Hacksaw Ridge. A Japanese sniper later said, "I had Doss in my sights 3 times, and every time I went to fire, my gun jammed." Under fire and unarmed, Doss rushed onto the battlefield.
I was praying the whole time. Please, Lord. I just kept praying, Lord, please help me get one more. Help me get one more. One more. When I got this, I say, Lord, please help me get one more. Help me get one more. One more. Help me get one more.
Desmond's commanding officer told him it was a miracle what you did on that ridge. The courage you showed, under fire, terrified, and alone, is a miracle. Desmond responded, "I wasn't alone."
It looked like somebody was bent over and had their head in the window of the deer blind. It either heard me or smelt me, and he pulled his head out of the tent and stood straight up, and that shocked me. They don't make people that big.
The way it moved, almost as if it was gliding across the beach. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. They were screaming at each other in gibberish. It sounded like a language, and they were chuntering away back and forwards, back and forwards, back and forwards. I know what a bear looks like, and there is no way on this planet that what I saw were bears.
What are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
Zia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
Ho, 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 ho. Merry Christmas!
Merry Christmas, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you, the Christmas show. This is like Sasquatch Chronicles Christmas party. So thanks so much for being here tonight. You know, the Christmas show I was going to kind of do away with and just take the time off. But you know, I know a lot of people are struggling this year, and it's supposed to be a happy time, but it's not always a happy time. And, you know, people are traveling, looking for something to listen to. So thanks for hanging out with me tonight. You know, the Christmas show, I try and go back and grab some of the episodes, some of the guests that really stuck out with me. And this year was really tough. I mean, I could do like 10 Christmas shows. It was really hard to kind of pick the ones that I wanted to play for you. But I hope you're happy with my my selection tonight. As always, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. You know, one of the guests that really stood out to me this year was episode 608. You know, people from all walks of life see this creature and have had run-ins with this creature. And I talked to a lot of wildlife biologists off the air. It's a whole different story getting one to come on the air. In episode 608, I spoke with Chris. And Chris is a former wildlife biologist from Washington State. And he talked about two visual encounters he had on his property, along with a lot of weird things that went on. And it was really cool to talk with Chris and kind of get his insight on the creature and his thoughts on it. This is episode 608 with Chris, who is a former wildlife biologist from Washington State. Let's take a listen.
We've been here about 60 years total. And there have been a number of things over the years that have happened.
60 years. When did it start? When did all of it kind of...
Well, when I was a little kid, you know, my grandfather built the place on his own with the help of his brother. And he was a World War II vet. And I think there were a lot of his friends were up here, too. They were all vets. And it was a time, I think, in our country when you could afford to go out and have some vacation property for not a relatively big cost. And it was kind of nice. People would come up and visit. One of his friends had another lot here, and he has since passed. But I would hear these strange screams, and I was always interested in bugs and birds and everything else. And I eventually became a wildlife biologist. But I would hear these screams, and the first time I ever really understood what those screams were was listening to a recording of, I think it was Ohio or Ontario, some recording that was across a lake from someone. Couple had been out, and they couldn't really identify this vocalization, but it was pretty telling. And when I would ask these guys, the reason I say they were World War II, that's because I'm thinking maybe they didn't hear so well. And they would say things like, well, those are coyotes, or, there's lots of dogs in the distance making noise, and all those things I'm sure were true. But these were pretty unique screams coming from, I'd say, about 1,500 feet up, and we're at about 500 feet. So upstream, probably less than a mile away, but really loud. I mean, and I know folks lived up there, they had to hear that as clear as a bell, because as a little kid, I heard it. Later on in life, I got out of the military, and I had a girlfriend, and no one really lived at this place full time. So we'd come up here on the weekends and just relax. And one day we were walking down the river. It's the property pretty much as a frontage on the river for about 2,500 feet or so. And we were rock hopping. You got those big round rocks in the Northwest, and you can't really walk on a riverbed without rock hopping. And we were doing that all the way down to where this creek comes in. And about halfway to the creek, we got this really strange cracking of branches. Just, I looked at it later when I went fishing, and the branches were about 2 inches, and they were those, how a cedar tree out west the branch will kind of swoop down, and then it comes back up to reach sunlight. And they're pretty big cedar trees. We're talking like 30 inches or more. So pretty big branches, but whatever it was breaking branches and just mowing down vegetation. But it was out of sight. I mean, you couldn't see anything. And the only explanation I had back then was, well, it's probably a bear. But, a bear would want to get away from us. It wouldn't want to basically pace us. And this thing paced us for probably 500 feet. At that time, I hadn't really thought a lot about Sasquatch. I'd seen the Patterson film, and I'd seen some other things, but that wasn't really high on my list. I hadn't been to college yet. I hadn't really looked at this kind of thing like a lot of folks do as kind of a science now. So I didn't really think about it a lot, but there were other things that happened during those times too. And one of them was we'd be laying in bed at night, and these, what I later figured out, were pine cones from a Douglas fir tree, which, that tree is probably 50 yards away. There's no way those cones could make it to the house, but something would throw these cones onto the house, and it was an A-frame, so they would bounce all the way down, and you could hear this bing, 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 bing. And it was cedar shakes back then, so it made a lot of noise because there wasn't any insulation. I mean, it really was just a cabin. And the next day I went up and looked, and there were probably 20 or 30 of these pine cones on one end of the house, right where we had heard these noises for a couple of hours. And that was kind of interesting too. I didn't know how to explain that. I just had to chalk it up to, well, it wasn't windy, so maybe some kids were out there messing around. I really don't know. That would seem to be really unlikely in this neck of the woods. You're likely to get a dog put on you or worse.
Yeah, or a shot.
Yeah. If you're out doing something like that around here, I mean, there are some people around who will do some nutty things, but not at night and not with pretty secluded houses like this where pretty much everybody's packing. So that was pretty strange as well. Same girlfriend on that one, and she was pretty scared of this place. She didn't. The thing that happened at the river was one year, and the next year we had the whole pine cone thing, and she wasn't so hot on coming up here with me a lot after that. And as relationships go, that kind of faded away. I guess the next thing I would have had happen that really solidified what I was experiencing all these years, for me anyway, was my parents had sold a house somewhere else and they were moving in here to this place and having it remodeled because they're older and they couldn't do stairs as well anymore. And they were having basically an addition put on to this house. So some nicer bedrooms downstairs and better showers, better insulation, all that stuff. So they had been living here about 8 months before the work was going to get started. And I pulled in one night pretty fast. Like I said, we're about a half mile from the 2-lane highway. So you go through pretty extensive piece of forest before you can get here. And I had, at that time in my life, had taken to driving that gravel road. If it were late at night, I'd drive it pretty fast because no one's out walking around usually. And I swung into the what we call a driveway. It's really just, people here don't have yards. The forest is your yard. And how much you mow it or prune it is how much space you have, which is kind of unique. So there's a little bit of grass, but I got out of the car and I went to get the dog at the other side and got her out on the leash. And I was holding my headlamp in my right hand and the leash in my left. And I was going over these sword ferns and vine maple, pretty thick, about 5-6 feet from the car. And I was running my headlight over him just to see what was there. And here's this face looking back at me. And it was it's kind of freaky to talk about still, but this thing I saw was certainly, I'm pretty well acquainted with everything in the forest. Formerly being a biologist and working with wildlife for a living, and this thing just didn't fit in any box I had ever seen. So I knew better than to flip out and start screaming or kick it or do anything crazy like that. So I ran the light over it and I said to myself, I did not just see that. There's just no way I just saw what I just saw. That's impossible. So I ran the light over it once again, moving my arm to the right. And certainly there it was. I mean, this thing, its head was about 3.5, 4 feet from me. It's I would say its eyes were probably level with my sternum, the beginning of my sternum, the lower end, and I'm a little under 6 feet. Its head was pretty big. Its eyes were 2.5, 3 times the size of my eyes, or what you would think, a regular human's eyes would be. The nose was hooded. It was out a little bit. It wasn't completely flat, but it was hooded. And the space between the nose and the the nose and the upper lip was huge. A lot of space. And the opening for the mouth, there wasn't much of, when you look at humans, there's a pretty pronounced lip. And this thing pretty much its mouth went across its whole face, and there really weren't any lips to speak of, but its forehead was also pretty noticeable, and it had some wrinkles in it. It was ashen gray. Its whole face was ashen gray, but kind of dark, if that makes sense. Almost like somebody who's really sick. It had this hair on the top of its head, and I would say it was kind of cone-headed, but the hair on its head later on reminded me of, like an 80s metal band or something.
Yeah, kind of that rocker look.
Yeah.
I've heard that before. Yeah.
Like the business in the front, party in the rear kind of look. Not that it's haircut or anything, but then as you look down, the width of this thing was not, I hear other people talk about their encounters as being, shoulders the size of basketballs. And it wasn't that. I would say big softballs, bigger than a softball. It wasn't ginormous like that, but it was pretty wide. I mean, it was a few feet wide. And originally I had thought it had been sitting. Whatever it was, it must have been sitting there. But then as I started thinking about it, it made more sense that it was probably in a crouching position, because I could see its arms. Just the top of the shoulder is kind of pointed inward. And it's like its arms were folded in towards its body, like it was maybe protecting its core or something like that. But I think it was crouched. I think I caught it off guard. I think I pulled in really quick and got out, and my headlights never swept that part of the forest, and it's still unlit to this day. The nearest floodlights are about 30 feet away, although the other side of the house has what we'd call now a booger light, I think, what you guys call them. And I've been thinking about putting one out there.
Chris, can I ask you, did the expression change at all when he hit it with the light?
No, it didn't change. I didn't see the eyes move. It was pretty quick. I'd say 1/1000. So maybe a second and a half on each sweep of the light I spent on it, which was more than enough for me to determine, well, this is definitely real. But no smell. The hair was dark reddish brown, more brown than reddish, but just a little bit of rust in the hair. It was freaky to see.
Yeah, they are. They absolutely are. So what happens next? You're standing there, trying to get your poor dog out.
I'm trying to get this old dog I have, and she was about 10 years old, and she was nearly blind, but I just left it. It's like I said, it's not a good idea. I've been around mountain lions. I've been around grizzly bears and black bears and, bears with cubs. And it just isn't a good idea to linger around wild animals, period. So I walked over to the porch, which is about 50, 60 feet away. And my dad met me there and asked me what was wrong because apparently I looked pretty freaked out. I was probably pretty much white with just fear, just that primal kind of fear. And I said, well, I'm just tired from the drive. And because, they were moving in here. They were going to make this their home. And then they did. The last thing I wanted to say was, hey, by the way, you have a buddy out there in the woods.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was hard enough for myself to just take that in. And I was up all night reasoning, like, what could that have been? And could it have been any other animal? And when I started to talk to my dad about it the next morning, and I said, there was an animal out there last night that just was the strangest thing I've ever seen. And he said, really? He said, and he said, was it a bear? And I said, no. And then he said, well, was it a deformed bear? And I said, well, no, that's not very likely either because, deformed animals don't make it too far in life. They can make it a little ways, but definitely wasn't a bear. But he went right for the bear explanation. And I think I understand better now why people do that. I mean, for one thing, it's a little easier to comprehend.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I think your average person, they try to make sense of it. I talk to eyewitnesses all day long, and hunters are notorious for it because they'll go, I saw this really weird bear. And then as they're describing it, I'm like, that's not a bear. That's not a bear. I know it's not a bear. It's not a bear. I mean, who do you think you're talking to here, guy?
Yeah, exactly. And if I figured out that if it would have stood up, I mean, completely erect, it was, its head at that point, crouch, was at the bottom of my sternum. So I'm 6 feet, say 8 or 9, maybe 8.5. I mean, it would have been pretty tall. And later I did get a look at the silhouette of one.
Let me ask you, before you go into that,
Sure.
Did your dad ever come clean? I mean, he lived out there his whole life. Did he kind of...
No. My grandfather had built the place, and he spent, a good part of his leisure time packing into the North Cascades. His brother-in-laws all did the same kind of activities. I think they knew things. I think they had stories. I think it was very hard for them as well to reconcile, what is that? Is that just a wild human? And trying to make it fit into a box. If I had a hard time with that, being a biologist, now I'm pretty sure what I was looking at, but that was a different era. I don't think people talked about that stuff much. And, a lot of people in that era too had, this is late 50s, early 60s to late 60s. They'd seen some pretty horrible stuff in World War II as well. So there's probably not much they could see that would freak them out more.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of those guys, when they came back from World War II, they did see a lot of bad things. And it's a different type of generation. Wouldn't you agree, Chris? I mean, my father, who's passed away now, is from that generation. And they just didn't talk about things. I mean, to get a guy like that to open up, especially the World War II generation, they don't talk about things, And I know the area where your property's at. And I told you not to be kind of vague so no one shows up. But I know the area well, and that area is well known for encounters. I will tell you that for a long time. It's a long history, and even going back to the World War II era, they called them wild men. They didn't know what else to call them. They would just call them the wild men out there. But it makes you wonder if he did know something else was going on. He just didn't want to say.
I think the ecologically, I look at these things often from a biological and ecological standpoint, and I think, well, back in the 60s, we still had pretty strong salmon runs. So these things could have just gone down to the creek and pretty easily gotten some great meals, lots of protein and fat. I think as those things have disappeared, they either live on the fringes of society where they can scavenge a bit, or they're, out in the wilderness where they can have their pick of whatever prey is available. That's just my take on it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a really good point. And I want to ask you, before you go on, being a wildlife biologist, did it kind of crush your worldview as far as what's out there?
In a way, I mean, I had a hard time putting it into it didn't fit in any box of anything I knew. And sometimes we like to think we know everything, but we know very little. I mean, when it comes down to it, if you look at the top of that evolutionary tree with, the ape being one line, and then the next one is like closer to a modern human, and the next one's even closer and closer. And that's just the top of the tree. I mean, we don't even know what all those branches are in the bottom. We got a few. We know what they are, but unless you find a skeleton somewhere, you just don't know. So I always like to approach it with, I know a lot less than I think. So, yeah. And after seeing this thing, I know even less. Anything you learn should just beg more questions. So, yeah, it was more about where it fits, and it just didn't make sense, to me anyway, that there's an ape running around the Pacific Northwest. I mean, even though I'd seen all the stories and I'd read them, and I didn't discount it. I mean, I thought, sure, that could happen. I just didn't think I'd be looking at one.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, I got a bunch of questions, but I'm curious about your next encounter. Tell us about it. Was it around the same type of time frame, or did it happen later in life?
Later. This was the last visual sighting I had was about, almost 5 weeks ago. And of course, you're never expecting these things, but we have these power lines, pretty normal for a housing development, but they're surrounded by trees, so we try to keep them clear so trees aren't coming down on them and taking the power out or starting fires, things like that. And I was with my dog, new dog, and that's an important factor, I think, because this dog stopped and sat down, and I looked over at these trees, probably about 50 to 60 yards away. And through the trees, I can see that power line right of way, I guess you'd call it. And there's about what I later measured out to be about a 9-foot creature, pretty thick. I just saw it from profile. The sun was setting, and it's always dark in a forest anyway. So it was dark in color. That's all I can say, like a dark brown to black. It was about 9 feet tall, and it was walking up that power line like it was gliding. There was, how when humans walk, there's kind of a bounce. I mean, more so with people that are flat-footed, maybe. But there's almost kind of a lift forward with humans, and this thing looked like it was skating on ice or something. And the dog's been really helpful with that stuff. That's I think I told you earlier about, when she stops, and that's not normal for her to stop because that's where she normally wants to walk, right in that area. But if she stops and sits, that's a pretty good indication that at least for the time being, I'm not going to drag her over there. That thing was about 9 feet tall. I didn't get any specifics on it or whether it was the same creature or not. I would have no idea. But have been some other things too. There's been some slaps on the house, some taps that are pretty regular, at least once a week, sometimes twice. My mother experienced a slap on the side of the house, and it wasn't, I'm not saying it absolutely was one of these things, but it wasn't, the conditions didn't exist for it to be a branch or anything else. I mean, there wasn't any wind. And last January, I was working on a gate. There was this incredibly, the smell. The dog got up on her hind legs and started snapping at the air. And she obviously smelled it before I did, which makes sense. And when I smelled it, it was a pretty horrendous smell. I've never smelled anything like it. Kind of a combination of rotting flesh, maybe a wet dog, but just a lot of rot. If you've smelled things like that, like roadkill that's been out in the sun baking, it was pretty close to that. And later on in the day, we were over in the same area and we had a growl that was really low frequency, and you could just feel it in your chest. And at that point, I just grabbed the dog and we went inside for a bit, and it didn't come out for a few hours.
Yeah, I mean, one question I want to ask you before we go on, being a wildlife biologist, and you saw how this thing went up that power line trail, and how it moved, and knowing that there's really no primates that move like they do, at least to my knowledge. Does that throw you off a little bit as far as what this thing is? Because they don't move like a gorilla, they don't move like a chimpanzee, and they don't really move like a human.
No, I just take it to be one of those adaptations in the middle of that evolutionary tree, if you will, that are it's one of those middle branches. And I tried to walk like that just to see what it would be like to remain level and to walk without letting your head bob or your shoulders bob at all. And it's hard to do, but you can do it. It makes me think about the energetics of these things and how they're physiologically made up. What's their bone structure? Do they have a really short tib fib? I don't know how they're doing it, but they're doing it with ease.
It's fascinating you bring that up, and maybe I'm off on what you just said, but one thing I can tell you is their knees are about where our shins are at. Our knees are about 50% of the way up from our legs.
Right.
Their knees are actually closer to where our shins are at. It's very bizarre. It's very bizarre to see one. I've never seen one run up a hill like what you're talking about. But I can tell you their knees are in a different position than ours are.
Well, maybe that might be part of the equation, because this one walking just did not elevate itself at all with a step. So maybe maybe their step, like when we step, we're moving our whole leg, and maybe they really aren't moving their whole leg. Maybe they're moving what is essentially their lower leg and foot, and that's it. And they got a gait that allows them to kind of look like they're just sliding along. It's hard. It's hard to. It's like I said, in the beginning, it's hard to put that in a box. I mean, for me, I'm pretty sure someone's got a sample of one of these things. There's just too many witnesses, and too much has been written and talked about them in a variety of venues to believe. I have to believe that someone's got a sample somewhere, and they probably know these things about them. But whether we'll ever know that for sure, I don't know.
One of the guests I often think about is Norm from episode 616. The name of the episode is I Chased This Creature Across a Walnut Grove. And I talked with Norm. Norm's actually a retired highway patrolman, And Norm talked about an encounter he had back in 1958 on his father's property. And I think they were chasing this creature in like a 1941 pickup. But Norm is just one of those guys to where I could have sat and listened to him talk all night. There was a few moments during the interview, I cut it out of the show, but I just sat, I was a listener. And I was like, oh, that's right, I'm supposed to be asking questions. Let's take a listen.
The Walnut Ranch where this occurred is in Lake County in Northern California. It's about 120 miles north of San Francisco, about 130 miles west of Sacramento. And it's up in a mountainous area, lots of brushland, a lot of forest, pine forest. And so this walnut orchard project that my dad was a general manager of was created out of all this very high, thick brushland. And the area is very volcanic, volcanic soil, volcanic rocks, that kind of thing. It's very so they carved this orchard out of a pretty rough area. But the ranch is surrounded on all sides by some very, very dense brush that I don't know what lives out there. Deer. We had a lot of deer and stuff like that. But anyway, I grew up on this ranch, and I lived there from the time I was 4.5 years old until I went off to college at age 18. And my dad engineered this whole ranch, and the irrigation system was really a difficult thing for him to put together. And so he had this plan eventually that he was going to irrigate the orchard 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, starting in May, and shutting off the irrigation system in September. So he started hiring people from the local town of Kelseyville and Lower Lake and places like that. And these people didn't work out very well. They were not very reliable. They were out there, and they didn't do a very good job. They were drinking on the job. They never showed up for work. And so my dad had a lot of problems with these guys. So he fired them all and really thought he probably was going to give up on his 24-hour irrigation project, when my brother and I thought that, every summer we worked on the ranch, and we thought if we could talk him into letting us just manage the irrigation system, and he just would not have anything to worry about, he just let us do it, then we'd make more money, and we could set our own schedule and do whatever we wanted to do in our off time. And so we approached him, and eventually, after about a day or so, he said, yeah, you guys can go try it, see how it worked out. He saw that we could do it, so we're out there in the middle of the night, 2-3 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes we get up, we go out, and we just move this irrigation pipe all through the orchard. And so on this particular evening, it was probably around 7:30 in the evening, and the sun had just kind of gone down or behind the hills, and we were all done moving the irrigation pipe. And what we were doing, and we had a friend with us that also worked with us, a guy by the name of Jack. He was about our age. And so we were in this old Chevy pickup, old 41 Chevy pickup that my dad had. And we were just driving around the ranch, and we were just looking at the irrigation system to make sure the sprinklers were not plugged up, that the lines were not blowing apart and all that kind of stuff. And I came down to this one corner. It was kind of an intersection. Our orchard was laid out, the 500 acres was laid out in 40 and 55 acre kind of plots. And so each 40 acre parcel of walnut orchard was a quarter of a mile square, 320 feet on all four sides. And if you went diagonally across the 40-acre field, is about 1,870 feet. And this part of the orchard was pretty flat at the bottom where we spotted this creature, but at the top where it eventually went, it got very steep. It got up to like 15% grade, and it was very steep. And because there was a lot of irrigation going on in there, it was muddy in there too. But anyway, to just back up a little bit, we were coming down this road. We made a right turn at this intersection. There was not supposed to be anybody in the orchard. There's not going to be anybody on the ranch. All the hired hands, there are about 5 of them, they went home at 5 o'clock. Mom and Dad are home in the ranch house. And we came around this intersection, and we see something on 2 legs, a bipedal creature of some kind. Didn't know what it was, didn't know what it was walking through the orchard. It was about maybe 75 feet, maybe 100 feet back in the orchard. So we couldn't see anything but just about the knees down or thereabouts. So I kind of pulled the truck around to try to get a better look at what was walking out there. And before we could identify this thing or even get a full look at it, it took off running. So I could see that the animal or the creature or whatever we thought it was at the time was taking off at a diagonal across this particular 40-acre field. And so I accelerated this old Chevy truck, and I couldn't drive through the orchard because it's wet and plowed field and it just gets stuck. So I had to use the farm roads. So I went all the way down, had to drive a quarter of a mile down to where our barns are, turn right, and go up this very steep hill to try to see if I could intercept, this thing that we saw running through the orchard. And so the whole time I was driving and trying to get to a place where we could get a better look at what this thing might be, my brother and this kid Jack, were kind of keeping me informed about the location and the progress of this thing as it came across the orchard. So we got about halfway or maybe 2/3 of the way up the hill, and at the top of the hill was another intersection where more 40-acre parcels came together, and we just stopped the truck and we got out, and between us and the orchard was a really wide drainage ditch that was probably 10 or 12 feet wide and maybe 15, 20 feet wide at that point, probably. And this thing came running up the hill, and we stood there. What we thought was coming through the orchard was a man. And the reason we thought that in the beginning is because about 1.5 miles or 1.75 miles or so to the kind of the east of us was a forestry fire camp. And this fire camp was made up of inmates, convicts from San Quentin prison in the San Francisco Bay Area. They were nonviolent offenders, and they used them. They were kind of like trustees, and they used them to fight fire. And they were pretty successful at doing that. They actually probably outworked the employees in the fire camp. But that's who we thought it was, because we had a history of these guys running off from the fire camp, and they would run across our property and they would try to get to the nearest town of Kelseyville or Lower Lake or whatever, and somehow, hide in somebody's trunk. Now we're talking about the 50s now, where, we had a lot of old cars where you just turned a handle and you lifted the trunk lid and you just climb in. And there were a couple of cases of adjacent ranches where when the women went to town, they unknowingly transported a convict in the trunk of their car. Got to town, they jumped out and run around with their orange suit on, I guess. So that's kind of what we thought was going to be coming up the hill. But when we saw this thing, and it was about 7 or 8 feet tall, it looked to me like it had facial features like an Indian, not the Indians of California in my area, but the Indians of the middle part of the United States. And so this thing, we could hear this thing coming because he was huffing and puffing. because it's really a steep hill. And this creature, 7-8 feet tall, completely covered with hair, could see no ears. It looked like the shoulders just went up and met the top side of the head. But it had a kind of a rounded head. It had a kind of a broad but long nose. It was kind of hooded like a human, and it had thinner lips than other photographs that I've seen of these things, and it did not have this big barrel chest that so many of the witnesses on your show, Wes, report. This thing was more lean. You know, it probably weighed about 500 or maybe more pounds, but it didn't have this great big, I mean, it was bigger than Hulk Hogan and guys like that. Don't get me wrong. This thing was huge, but it just didn't have this massive chest. And I, you know, and some people have reported that, you know, it had like 5 foot wide shoulders, and this creature was not quite that wide. I would say maybe 4 feet at the most. Arms hung down to below the knees, and this thing's, as it was running, its arms were really swinging in a like 180-degree arc, and it as it came up the hill and it got into the top part of the orchard where the trees were a little smaller because the soil isn't quite as good as down at the bottom of the hill. Why, we could see it a lot better because it was running through smaller trees, and it looked directly at us. And when it did that, my brother and Jack, they wanted to get the heck out of there. Get in the truck. Let's get the heck out of there. I wanted to see where this thing was going, because it looked to me like it was on a mission to go from point A to point B without any interruption and without any real interaction with anybody else. And so when it was coming up the hill and we looked at this thing, it never showed its teeth. It never made any noise other than just heavy breathing and just a little bit of the sound of its footfalls, but not much there, because the orchard was cultivated, and so it's not running on firm soil, on firm ground. It's running in plowed ground that's probably 8 to 10 inches deep, plowed. So not easy going for anybody, including this creature. When we looked at this thing, we had no idea what we were looking at. We had no frame of reference of that. I never heard of a Sasquatch. I never heard of a Bigfoot. I never heard of anything that even closely resembled this thing. There was nothing ever mentioned in school. None of my friends, no adult that I'd ever listened to ever mentioned anything about a creature like what we saw that evening. And it turned and looked at us, and the impression that I got is it kind of grinned at us, but it showed no teeth. And that's when everybody wanted to jump in the truck and just, skedaddle out of there. So when it went by, we jumped back in the truck and we took up. Keep in mind, we got this old 41 Chevy with a 60 horsepower 6-cylinder engine. We're not talking about a muscle car here. And so we took off, and I tried to catch up to it, get a better look. Everybody, my brother and Jack were telling, they don't want to get too close to this thing because they were afraid. And frankly, I didn't feel that way. It was creepy to see this thing. It was creepy when it kind of grinned or whatever it did. That kind of creeped us out. But I didn't feel like I was threatened. It didn't make any gesture. It didn't make any movement, any furtive movement of any kind that really would indicate, hey, I'm going to come over and just rip you to pieces. Never had that feeling ever during this encounter. So we took off up the hill in the old Chevy, grinding up this steep hill, and we closed on this thing to about, I want to say 100 to 150 feet, when it finally came out of the field and crossed a pretty large intersection where all these fields and branch roads come together. And when it came across that road and that intersection, it turned and looked back at us. And when it did, it just had to kind of torque its whole body around so that it could. I mean, when I wrote to you, Wes, I think I said, it kind of looked over its left shoulder, sorta, but that wasn't. I mean, it couldn't turn its head. I don't know why these things are built the way they are. I don't know what that design, is made for. I really don't know. But it had to turn its entire body to look around, and so its left shoulder and everything all turned and just twisted around. And when it did that, it slowed down, and so we got a little bit closer, and so we were just looking at this thing, and it took off into another 40-acre parcel on our ranch. And so plowed ground, I can't drive out there with this little two-wheel drive pickup. It gets stuck. So I have to, I want to try, I'm looking at this thing. It appears that it's going to run across this thing on a diagonal again for some reason. So I go down these ranch roads. I go all the way around, got to go a quarter mile this way, quarter mile that way to get around so I can see this thing. And finally, when it came out of the orchard and crossed the farm road that we were on, we got another pretty good look at it and how it ran. And I wouldn't say, I don't remember that it looked like it was gliding, because some people talk about how these things look like they're gliding. It wasn't really like that, although it did not bend its knees. It's like Patty, when she ran. The knees were bent. They're not straight like a human. And so it ran across the road in front of us, and at that point we were right at the base of a hill, and it ran across the road, and it ran into a property owned by the Wiper family, and not anymore. It's all grapes by some other vintner that bought up all the land up there. But at that point, it was owned by a private a family, and it ran through the area in front of their barns and their shop. And of course, there was nobody there. And it ran through between the barns and the shop, and through about another couple of 100 feet of their orchard, which was walnuts also. And then it just ran into the brushland, into this brush that's 10, 15, 20 feet high, and very difficult for a man to even walk through it. And this thing just plowed through it like nothing could stop it. So when we lost sight of it, we went back to where we originally saw this thing. And that part of the orchard right there where we saw it had just been irrigated within the last day or two, and so it was still pretty wet. And all this ground is volcanic, and it just gets real muddy when it and just soggy, and it's almost like clay, almost pulls your boots off, when you walk through it. This thing ran through there, and so we're just kids, we're not thinking about trying to get a cast of some foot or try to figure out what kind of footprint this thing is leaving. We just never thought about that. It's not even in our minds. But we did look and see how wide the stride was, and the stride at the bottom of the hill, and it may have shortened a little bit at the top, was about 25 feet. Each step was about 25 feet. So that meant the orchard was laid out in a way that the rows of trees were 50 feet apart. And so it cleared an entire row between two rows of walnut trees, in about 2 steps. And it continued that pace all the way up the hill. And I'm pretty sure that it wasn't taking a 25-foot stride maybe at the top of the hill, but pretty close to it. So a few weeks ago, I calculated that at 25 foot at a stride of 25 foot, that creature would have been able to navigate that 40-acre field in a diagonal direction, 1,870 feet, in about 60 or 70, maybe 80 steps. That's all. And it did that in probably 70 seconds. That's about the time it took for that thing to cross 1,870 feet of diagonal orchard. And that works out to 31 feet a second, or about an average speed of about 21 miles an hour. But when it got to the top of the hill, then the orchard flattened out a little bit for probably a couple of 100 yards. And then it dropped off into about a 12 to 15 degree downhill grade. And the creature was actually, the speed of the creature actually increased a little bit as it went down this hill. It looked like it was on a mission. It looked like it knew where it was going. I have no idea where it was going. All there was in the direction that it was running was the fire camp and a small cattle ranch that was about another 1.5 miles away. And then beyond that, it was just a pine forest and just brushland that hadn't burned in probably 100 years. And some of that brushland, some of the brush was some of those areas was like 30, 40 feet high. So it just plowed through that stuff. It was amazing. So we had a little powwow, my brother and Jack and I, and we were going to go tell my dad what we saw, because we were pretty upset and pretty confused about what we saw, because we just couldn't put it in a category because it just didn't fit anything. And then we continued to kind of ride around the ranch, check more of the sprinkler system. We're talking about it. We decided, no, we're not going to tell my dad. And the reason we decided to do that is because my dad paid us pretty well to do this job of moving irrigation pipe 24 hours a day, all summer long, 7 days a week. And we didn't want to lose that job. And we're just young teenagers. And if we thought that if he felt that it was too dangerous for us to be out there 2-3 o'clock in the morning with a headlamp on our head like a miner moving irrigation pipe around through the orchard, we thought we were going to lose our job. So we never told anybody ever. And my brother died in 1978, and I have no idea where Jack is. But my brother was an engineer for Halliburton, was killed in a gas well explosion. So to my knowledge, he never told the story to anybody. We just kept it to ourselves. About a year later, we kind of forgot about this. We kind of put it in the back of our mind. But I'll tell you this, every time for quite a long while, every time we went out in the middle of the night to try to move irrigation pipe, I always had this feeling. I think I might have been imagining it because overactive imagination, but I always felt that I wasn't alone, and so I was always flashing my headlight around to see what was around me, to make sure there was nothing sneaking up behind me, and there never was. And so after we had that job in the summer for years and years until we went off to college, we never had another encounter like that, never saw anything again like that, and didn't want to see really anything like that. About a year and a half after this encounter, my dad, who subscribed to True Magazine, read an article about Jerry Crew and his infamous encounters up in the Three Rivers National Forest, up in the Trinity Alps, up there, over there by Wairika and Eureka and over that way. And True Magazine wrote an article about his encounters, and my dad read that and kind of was talking about it, I guess. And so, you know, when he put the magazine down, I'm a year older. I picked it up and I start reading about this thing. And then later I see pictures that had been published in newspapers in the local area around Willow Creek and places like that. And when I saw some of this stuff and I read this article about Jerry Crew's encounters, then I knew what I saw. I knew that I'd seen a Bigfoot, and I knew exactly what it was that I saw that night. When I went to college, I had a couple of buddies who were criminal justice students. One later became a deputy sheriff up in Humboldt County, I think, and the other became a California highway patrolman in Mendocino County. And I later became a California highway patrolman myself later on in life after I got out of the military. But in college, we're sitting around, these two guys and I are sitting around, and we're just having a few beers, 19 years old, having a few beers. And I asked them, I said, where you guys live, have you ever seen one of these Bigfoot creatures? And I don't think they ever did, but they talked about a couple of encounters where they were deer hunting up in that area around Willow Creek, and they had their hunting dogs, and they ended up, and there was all this, they smelled these things. These creatures were throwing rocks at them, throwing tree limbs at them. The dogs were frightened to death. And, and in both encounters, I guess they said they packed up the following morning and got the heck out of where they were. So it was probably a year after the encounter that it was around the same time, I think, that maybe the article came out in True Magazine that my dad's younger brother was a general manager on a large sheep ranch in Sonoma County, and it was very remote, 4,000 acres. It was owned by a Hollywood producer, and they raised sheep originally back around the 1900s, or it was a racehorses there. And it's very mountainous and very rugged and very damp and foggy all the time because of its proximity to the Pacific Ocean. So my dad goes up there to hunt wild hogs with my uncle and a bunch of other people. My brother and I, we'd love to go, but we had to stay and work on the ranch. So he goes up there and they kill a bunch of hogs, and they're the kind of a combination of feral hog and Russian razorback hogs. Really, really nasty, mean, ornery things with a head like a piece of concrete. And so they killed a bunch of these hogs. They're probably 400 or 500 pounds, some of them. And so my dad came home with a couple of slabs of meat. They were about 100 pounds each. And so he went out on the backside of our house, and he put these two great big, kind of a big lag screw, big hook. He screwed them into the roof rafters, and then he hung these pieces of meat on these two big hooks and just let them hang out there at night in the cool air and kind of cure that way. And then in the morning, he'd go out, take them off the hooks, wrap them up in an old sheet or something he had, and then put them in an old sleeping bag, and they would slide them under their bed in their bedroom. Then at night, he would take them out of the sleeping bag and put them back up on the hooks. And that process went on for a couple of nights until he finally went out there one morning to remove these pieces of wild hog meat off these hooks. Keep in mind now, the roof rafters and these hooks are about 10 and a half and 11 feet off the ground, because that's the downside of the property where the ranch house was built on. So we had a lot of dogs. We had 5 6 dogs mostly all the time. So my dad goes out there and the meat is gone. I mean, it is just vanished. And he comes back in and he's, my brother and I were getting ready to go to school, I guess, and having breakfast or something. And he said, the meat is gone. So we all go out there. Yep, it's all gone. We looked at the hooks. There's no little shards of meat on there where something just reached up there, grabbed it, and just pulled it off the hook. The hooks weren't bent. There was no meat on the ground. We had coyotes in the area. They make a huge mess. They tear everything to pieces. And there was no evidence that it was that. We don't have wolves in Lake County. It just never. And black bears, very, very rare in that area where we were. In all my life, I never saw a black bear around where our ranch was. So my dad figured the dogs must have gotten it, must have jumped up there, grabbed on it, but there was no drag marks. There was nothing. And when my dad called all our dogs over to the place below where this meat had been hanging, dogs didn't want to go there. And he couldn't coax them. He couldn't coax them into that area for some reason. And when I remember back, I just found that to be so odd and fascinating that the dogs they never made a sound all night, because if there was anything, if a coyote went through there or a deer went through there, those dogs went crazy. They would chase it and they would bark and wake you up. But the night that this meat came out missing, not a sound. But dogs did not make a peep. So what happened to the meat? Maybe that Sasquatch that we saw, came back and had a little snack. I don't really know. I've had other friends that have had other encounters, and I'm a firm believer in these things. I know they exist. I have believed in them, in their existence all my adult life. And I have so many of my friends that work in Northern California that have seen these things. Law enforcement guys that are working up in the Weaverville area. They had a big fire up there one time, and fire was moving at about 35, 40 miles an hour. Every animal was running for their life. And this friend of mine, highway patrolman, he's retired now. He found tracks in the highway, state highway. And it's about an 80 foot to go across that highway. And these animals cleared it in, 2.5 steps or something like that. So they're running, everybody's running for their life. So they're in Northern California. They're very elusive, I'm sure. And I don't care to really come across one. I feel very fortunate that the encounter that I had was very uneventful in terms of threat to my safety. So.
Ho, 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 ho. Merry Christmas.
In episode 620, I interviewed Winston, who's from Texas, and he had an encounter back in 2010, and Winston's a hunter. And I remember after interviewing Winston, I thought, I gotta put this guy in my intro. Take a listen.
The second Saturday of November, at about in between 3 and 3:30, I was going for a late hunt and was going to sit there until dark in my deer blind that was set up out in the woods on some land that we hunted on. And I headed out to go hunting after I loaded up the gun and get to the deer blind. And I always walked through the woods instead of taking a deer trail that you could follow, and it led to where you could just step off of that and go right into the deer blind in the back. But I didn't like taking that, because if deer traveled that, I didn't want them to smell me, so I would always walk right through the woods straight ahead and go to a fence line and then turn left and follow that to the deer blind. And as soon as I hit the woods, I smelt a smell that I could only I can only describe it as a wet dog that had never known a bath mixed with a dead animal mixed with a porta can that has never been cleaned, and it's filled with piss and crap all the way to the top of the rim of the commode. And it was foul. And because I figured it might be a dead animal and it would screw up my hunt that day, I was looking for it as I was walking through the woods. And I would stop and be, Jesus, what is that smell? Looking around, and I could never find it. I just kept going, and I got to the fence line, and then took the left and started following the fence line. And I was probably, I want to say 50 or 60 yards from where you step into the woods to get in, because the deer blind was, between the fence and the woods, there was like a 5 or 6 foot spread of just a clear patch. And just you would have to step maybe 3 steps into the woods and to get to the deer blind. And I was probably 50 or 60 yards from it, and it looked like somebody was bent over and looking through the window, had their head in my deer blind of the window of the deer blind. And in my head, I thought, well, my dad's here. I didn't see his car. And I walked about 10 more yards, and I said, no, that's a big guy. That's got to be another hunter. So I popped my gun off a safe, and I took maybe 10 more yards, 15 more yards, and got closer and said, no, that's somebody in a ghillie suit. In my head, I'm saying this. And I get a little bit closer, and I said, no, that's some dummy in a Bigfoot suit, and that's a good way to get shot by somebody like me. And about that time, I was probably between 25 to 35 yards from it. And it either heard me or smelt me. And he pulled his head out of the tent and stood straight up. And that shocked me and froze me right where I stood. And I was trying in my head to figure out whether it was a guy in a Bigfoot suit or a real Bigfoot. And 2 years before Andre the Giant died, I ran into him in Abilene, Texas, coming out of the kettle. So I've met Andre the Giant before, and he was 7'6". He was a big guy, and whatever this was made him look like a little guy. So they don't make people that big, and I could see the muscles underneath its fur flexing and working. I could see, any time it breathed, I could see underneath its fur moving. So I knew deadgum well it wasn't somebody in a suit. That was something real. That was a real creature. And we probably stared at each other for what seemed like forever to me, but it was probably about 10, 15 seconds, and I didn't move. I was frozen. So it stomped the ground and did a grunt growl like, "Urgh." And when it did that, I bet you I jumped about a foot in the air, but I stayed frozen in fright and fear. And when it did that, from the distance it was away, the only way I can describe this is like a lion. When it roars, you can feel it reverberate in your body, in your chest, and that's what it did. And it kept me frozen in fright, and I didn't move, so it just turned around and walked away from me and literally stepped over a barbed wire fence, just pushed it down a little bit with its hand and looked back over its shoulder at me, kind of like the Patty did in the Patterson-Gimlin footage. And then it walked across a field, and halfway across a field, it looked back again at me. And when it got to the other side, there was another barbed wire fence, but there was trees going across that one, and it stepped over that barbed wire fence between a couple of trees that was maybe 5 or 6 inches in diameter, and when it reached up to use that as a brace, kind of like a human would, but instead of grabbing it like a human would with its thumb upwards, it didn't wrap its thumb around the tree like a monkey. It reached up and had the thumb pointing down, and with all of its fingers, thumb and all, it grabbed the tree, looked back at me, and stepped into the woods, and it was like it disappeared, like it was magic. It just vanished, and I didn't smell it no more, nothing.
Yeah, that's terrifying, man. That's terrifying to be that close with something so big. And what did you think, before we talk about, descriptions and everything, what did you think about the whole topic of Sasquatch prior to this?
I was on the fence about it. As a kid, I seen the Patterson-Gimlin footage, and that was pretty compelling to me, because when you watch that, I mean, you can see the shoulder blades moving and the muscles and stuff. So in my head, they existed, but I had never seen one before that day. And that was the turning point. I am no longer a believer. I am a knower of Bigfoot.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, if you would, for the audience listening, can you kind of describe when he turned and looked at you? Can you kind of describe for the audience what you saw?
Oh yeah, we stood and looked at each other without any woods or anything in between us for at least 15 seconds. I can tell you exactly what he looks like. Their face. I want to say the Harry and the Hendersons Bigfoot is close, but it's not exact. Their face isn't as monkey looking as Harry's face. They look more Neanderthal. It had a beard like a man. It had a mustache, but what it didn't have was a round head. It had a cone-shaped head like a gorilla's, and its shoulder muscles that connect to the bottom of our neck doesn't connect to the bottom of their neck. It connects to the back of their skulls like a gorilla, so it makes it look like it don't have a neck. And this thing was jacked like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, you could see the muscles underneath and the sheer body mass of this thing. I mean, I'm a 5'8", 5'9" guy, and I weigh about 155 to 165 pounds. And I mean, this thing's legs were as big as my torso or bigger. I mean, this thing was huge. It was, I work commercial construction too, so it was at least between 9 and 12 feet tall, somewhere in there. I mean, it was a big guy. And yes, it was a guy. I could see its genitals through the fur. When it walked away, I could see its muscles moving. I could literally see when it stepped and walked. I could see the mid-tarsal break in its foot, halfway up its foot. It like your toes bend when you step. Its foot in the middle of its foot bends.
Did the expression on the face change? Obviously, when it grunted, but as you were looking,
oh yeah, you could tell that it was startled at first when it looked at me, but it tried to present itself as it wasn't afraid, and it scowled at me a little bit, and I didn't move. So it stomped the ground and grunt and growled at me. And when it did, I mean, it had an evil look on its face when it did. I almost bolted, but I figured, like an animal, it might make it chase you, so I didn't. I just stayed frozen. Its color was a reddish brown, like an orangutan on its back, and on its shoulders it was a little bit darker, like a blackish color. Its arms long, and they go to like their knees, man. Their arms are long.
Was your blind set up for a long period of time, or had you just put it up?
Oh no, it had been set up since September. We always set our deer blinds up prior to the hunt so the animals get used to them. And actually 2 days prior, I was in the blind, and around 10 o'clock in the morning, a buck was chasing a doe. They were coming towards the fence line that I walked down. There was a spot in the field where the deer, we set it up there because you could get a shot at deer coming over the deer blind. And I thought to myself, when this buck jumps over this fence, I'm going to plug him. And the doe jumped over the fence. And as soon as it hit this side of the fence, it immediately jumped to the right over that fence that the Sasquatch through the trees jumped through. And the buck come over chasing her. But as soon as his front hooves touched the ground, he immediately jumped back over the fence line and took off. And I unzipped the tent and got out to get a shot because I seen him stop. And I pulled up my gun to get a shot. But when I did, I was looking at him, and he wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me. So I literally just put my gun down and turned around and was trying to figure out what the hell spooked it. But I could never see it. And to this day, I think that Sasquatch was there watching, but I never could see him.
Yeah, the behavior is really fascinating to me. It's almost like this thing was curious to see if you were in that little deer blind or not, and he wasn't paying attention to his surroundings.
Yeah, a couple of days after that, when I walked up on it, I think that it was checking to see if I was in there, and I wasn't in there, so it stuck its head. I'm just speculating this, but being curious, I think once it realized that I wasn't in there, it stuck his head in there and was looking to see what was in there, because we left candy bars and stuff in there.
The creature too, it didn't attack. How it was almost like a warning, like you see guys in bars that want to pick a fight, they always puff their chest out, and they usually tend to run their mouths, but they're the last guys to do anything. And the Sasquatch kind of, I know it's a bad comparison, the Sasquatch kind of reminds me of that, because it kind of did like a jerky motion towards you, stomped and growled, and you didn't leave, so it decided to leave. Thank God.
Yeah, I think he was bluffing me, but then again, and I had a gun with me is what drives me crazy. Now, if I could turn back time, I would have tried to shoot it. But at that time, I was trying to go through my head, trying to figure out whether it was a person, because it looked so human-like in the face, or whether it was a creature. But now I know, and it's not like I want to go out and kill the species, but we have, since that time, I have really gotten into watching Sasquatch documentaries and stuff. And it's like we have DNA evidence that they won't recognize because it's so human-like. We have hair that they won't recognize. We have footprints that they won't acknowledge. We have hair samples that they won't acknowledge. And to me, what we need, the only way you're going to get them to believe anything is if you bring one down to validate the species.
That's some nice piano playing. Hope everyone is enjoying the show. In episode 631, I interviewed Rick, and Rick is actually a long-haul truck driver, and he was in Arizona at the time. He stopped to go for a hike. He was on one of his breaks, and he decided to go for a hike to get out of the truck, and he was near the Mogollon Rim. And Rick's account's really bizarre, but just because there's not just Sasquatch, there's another creature involved in it. What's really fascinating about Rick's account is Rick had a picture of it. And when he first sent me the picture, I get pictures sent all the time, and I just kind of glanced at it and didn't really give it a second thought. And then Rick and I were talking about what happened to him, and I pulled the picture up, and I was like, wow, he really did capture something. It's a fascinating account. Take a listen.
I am a fuel delivery man, and I had a fuel delivery in Prescott, Arizona, and upon completion, I had to take a 34-hour reset before I could come back to Michigan. And I decided I was going to take a day hike because I didn't want to just sit in the cab of my truck and do nothing. And I love to hike, and I love to be out in the wilderness and in the forest and hunt and fish and loving every day. But I got to the trailhead. I met up with a couple of ladies that were going to do a day hike as well. So off and on through the day, we were hiking off and on together. And about 4 hours into our hike, I had noticed this tree off to my left front. And I thought, that's a peculiar looking tree. It doesn't look natural. It looks like some kind of a sniper's nest. The reason why I refer to it as a sniper's nest, I am a Marine veteran. My EAS was January 23rd of 1989. So even though I've been out of the Corps for 31 years, there's things that you never do forget. And I thought, well, that's kind of really peculiar. I wonder if that might be like a cougar's lair or something. But it's definitely looking out towards the trail. So I decided I was going to sit down and take a break and change my socks out and drink some water. And the ladies were quite a bit ahead of me. And as I'm looking at this tree and drinking my water, I noticed the tree started to shake a little bit. And then I seen this creature climb down from the tree. I won't say he so much climbed down from the tree as he stepped down from the tree. I mean, the creature was very large. And when I first seen him, I'm like, what in the world am I looking at? Am I on a movie set? So I'm looking all around for video crew or cameras or something. And as I'm looking around, I notice another creature come out from between the tree and stop at the base of the tree with the Sasquatch looking creature. And this creature was completely different than the one that had climbed down from the tree. And they were quite a distance from me. As you said, as you were looking at the photo originally, you couldn't see anything. And I don't want to say I wish I could have been closer because I feel I was close enough to these two creatures. But I definitely could tell that the one that joined up with the one that looks like a Sasquatch looked like a bear or a dog or something other than a Bigfoot. And both of them were standing upright, and both of them were quite tall. The creature that was in the tree was the tallest, and even at the distance he was at, I'm going to estimate he was anywhere from 8 to 10 feet tall. And the way I can judge that, if you're looking at the photo, you can see the two women on the trailhead, and then if you look to your left and you look at the two creatures, the lady was around 6 foot tall. And that's how I judged the size of that creature. And they looked like they were having a conversation at the base of the tree. And then the Sasquatch, I don't know if he is a Sasquatch. I don't know what either one of these creatures are. I had no reference to what they were. I had never seen really any footage of any kind of a Bigfoot encounter other than the $6 Million Man, which, that is a TV show. And as the two creatures were talking, the one I will call a Sasquatch, I guess, he pointed in the direction of the women and flicked his hand with his wrist motion. And the other creature, I'll call him a canine creature, took off towards the women. And that's when I realized I am not on a movie set. And I thought, I don't have any weapons on me. I'm not armed. What can I do? If I yell and then women take off running, the worst thing you can do is to run from a predator. I thought, well, the only thing I can do is try to draw their attention towards me instead of towards the women. So I jumped up. I started yelling at the top of my lungs, jumping up and down. The creatures stopped immediately, and the Sasquatch-looking creature went down to the prone position. The canine-looking creature, if you can imagine, like you're sitting down in a seat, he bent at the knees, and then he bent over at the waist, and he turned his head away from me. At that time, I decided I better take out my phone because I don't know if this is going to end well. So I took out my phone to call 911. I didn't have any phone service out there. But when I took out my phone, the canine-looking creature turned his head towards my direction, and the Sasquatch-looking creature raised up his upper body by his arms, and that's where you see the picture that I took. He's in the prone position, but holding his upper body up with his arms. You can see the way his head is cocked, and you can see, even though his face is not clear because of the distance, you can see that he has an inquisitive look on his face just by the posture of his head, that he's like, what am I looking at? I don't believe the creature's ever seen me. I had the wind in my face, and I believe that the Sasquatch creature, who was sitting in the tree, seen the two women walk down the trail quite a ways ahead of me and didn't even realize I was there. When I knew I didn't have any phone service, I decided I better take a picture, as I said. So I turned my phone around and I tried to zoom in as best as I could quickly, and I snapped a picture. And I wanted to capture not only the picture of the two creatures, but the women as well, because I figured if this ended the way I believed it was going to end, there should be some sort of evidence of not only the creatures, but the two women, as well as me, since it was my phone. So I snapped the picture, and as soon as I snapped the picture, the canine-looking creature came back upright and came towards me. I took my phone and I threw it off of the trail because I thought, well, my wife's going to send someone looking for me, or my boss is going to send someone looking for me. Someone's going to come looking for me. Everyone knew that I was going to be on that trail for the hike. I had informed my boss of what I was doing for the day so he could find me a safe haven for my truck. Being a hazmat tanker, you can't just leave it abandoned anywhere. It has to be in a safe, secure location. So my boss knew where my truck was and knew where I was going to be and what I was doing, as well as my wife. So I took my phone and I threw it. So when the authorities came searching, hopefully they would find my phone, find the picture, and put two and two together. And then I also had a walking stick with me. And when I threw my phone, I took my walking stick and I brought it up into the prone position. And the port arms position, and said, here we go. And I thought this was going to be it. Now I'm going to tell you what, I don't believe for 1 minute that I would have done any damage to these creatures, that I could have defended myself from these creatures. But again, all I was hoping to do at this point was to try to save the two girls. And when I brought the walking stick up to the port arms position, the canine-looking creature stopped in his tracks. And I thought, this is very peculiar. Does he think I have a rifle? So I took my rifle and I took my walking stick and I put it up into my right shoulder and acted like it was a rifle. At that time, the only sound I ever heard from anything, it sounded like they yelled no, or that the one creature yelled no or whoa to the canine-looking creature. He turned around and he looked back towards the Sasquatch. The Sasquatch came back up into the upright position. They turned around and they took off quicker than anything I've ever seen in my life.
In episode 641, I interviewed Doug, and Doug actually works in law enforcement. He comes to us from Northern California, and he describes driving home late one night and passing this creature on the side of the road. And it's a cool account. You know, the creature doesn't really react to Doug going by. And Doug, being in law enforcement, you know, he's got a trained eye, and he went over every detail that he could recall from that event. Take a listen.
I've been up here in the Northern California area since about 2005. I originally was up here going to school at Humboldt State University years and years ago in like 1979. Fell in love with the area. I thought it was real beautiful. The circumstances are such that I moved away from the area, went in the military, been in construction, and I got a job promotion to come up to this area at a very remote, isolated prison in Crescent City. And it was in 2005 during the height of the real estate market. We made a lot of money in the sale of a home, but my wife didn't join me. And what I had to do is I had to travel. It was a 2-hour and 40-minute ride over to Medford. It was once a week. I was going over there for some counseling work, trying to restore my marriage. And I was also driving across the pass. It's the 199. Goes from Crescent City over to Grants Pass. It has a sign right there as you come out of Crescent City, scenic highway. So it's extremely beautiful, very rugged and remote. And it's predominantly like a two-lane road through very rough granite mountains, and there's a river flowing there. It's just gorgeous. So when I was traveling back and forth, I was doing it twice a week, but this particular night was a weeknight, and I had gone over for the counseling. And the counselor asked me to stay behind that particular night. It was in 2006, and a Tuesday night, my son was at home, and I left from work, did the class, and staying behind with him. He took a little longer with catching up with folks and socializing a little bit. By the time he and I got to talk, it was probably close, a little bit after 9:30 or so. And then by the time he and I finished, it was after 10. So I had a long, long drive ahead of me, but I also had to stop and get fuel. So on the way, as you're leaving Oregon, you enter into California, and there's they call it a bug station. It's an inspection spot where they check fruits and things like that. And they were closed because it was, a little after 12 o'clock. And I pulled over, left the vehicle running with the heater so I could keep my legs warm because it was still wintertime. And I slept there till about 12:35, I believe it was, 12:30, 12:45. I checked the clock every once in a while and look up and make sure everything was okay. I said to myself, you're plenty rested, let's get going. So as I went, it goes down through, and you're now entering through a big tunnel through the mountain called Collier Tunnel, I believe is Collier or Coulter Tunnel. And it comes down a long, long grade, and it dumps out as it comes through. And you're entering now into a series of slow turning S-turns. And as you come down there, that's the snow line there also. That's the snow line at the tunnel. So if there's ever snow, generally that's where it's going to be. So as I came down out of the pass, it was probably about, 1:45, 10 minutes to 1 or so. I had passed the Caltrans equipment yard there. That's called Idlewild. And as I passed there, you keep coming, and it swings around, and there's some directional arrows there now. They weren't there years ago, and it says 20 miles an hour into the turn. So while I was driving, my highlights were up because it's super, super dark through there. There's no lights. And the highlights are up higher and out further. So I was driving, and I was just watching my highlights and just taking in the scenery and taking my time. And as I came through that one turn, it says 20 miles an hour. The truck that I was driving, I was actually taking it about 12 to 15 miles an hour. I was just no brakes or nothing and just cruising through there real nice and slow. So as I came around the corner, the rail that was on the riverside has like 8x8s with that metal part on the top. And I was watching the shadows of the rails up in the trees. And as I came around the corner real nice and slow, all of a sudden I saw this huge, huge, huge shadow that was way up in the trees. And I immediately followed it straight back to the highway, which was probably about somewhere 60, 65 to maybe 75, 80 yards in front of me. It was way out in front of me, and I saw this giant creature right out in front of me. And the first thought in my mind was giant gorilla, because that's what I saw. It looked like a gorilla to some extent to me. But immediately upon focusing on him, I realized that's not a gorilla because it's too big, because it was just monstrous. So as I was just going real slow, I just had my guess is anywhere from 5, 7 to maybe at the most 8 seconds to just take in everything as I watched him from behind. He was on the opposite side of the road of me, going in the same direction that I was traveling, but his back was to me, but he was on the other side of the road like he was walking against traffic right along the very edge of the pavement. On my side of the road, there isn't a foot and a half because it's sheer granite cliff that goes straight up, because I was on the mountainside and he was on the riverside. And as I looked, there were certain things that really caught my attention because I noticed that I first thought, does he even have a head? Because it was just shoulders all the way across, and they were just monstrous. And his head was coned a little bit at the top, but it blended into his trapezoids and his shoulders really well, so you almost didn't see it at all. And I saw how big his deltoids were. That's the shoulder muscles, and how long his arms were. And it struck me as odd because his hands were clear down by his knees. They weren't all the way to his knees. And his arms were long and skinny, bicep, tricep area. And his forearms were just huge. You know, most of it was because of the hair that was on his arms. So when I was watching him, I took in the color. I saw how long his hair was. I looked at his build, and I was just kind of just going, whoa, my jaw just dropped as I'm driving up to him, and I'm getting closer and closer. And the thing that was odd to me regarding him is he didn't care one bit that I was there. He didn't run off and try to hide or avoid me or nothing. He just walked. He had no care in the world. And I saw his arm swing, and I watched how his right hand, I noticed the right one predominantly because as it swung into the back, it's a long arm swing, but his hand in the back, when it got to the rear of his full length motion there, his wrist would turn funny, like a little weird turn. And that's when I saw his fingers and just a portion of his palm, because the hair in his forearms and hands was completely covering it. And I did see the same length of hair from his knees down, like a little above his knees, you would think of it. It just got longer and longer from that portion of his leg. And I did see the hair hanging from the middle of his groin area. It was hair that was hanging down there. It was just long and thin. So the color of it was if you want to call it like a gray, or it was real light powdery gray, almost like a silver. And his hair was a dark charcoal smoky gray, and it just looked all matted and mangy. It was long. It was at least 6 inches in some places, and it was thick and mangy. It looked like, if you want to call it like bedhead, like maybe if he was sleeping, he just got up and his hair was just all messy and yucky. The hair on his shoulders was full, and then it got shorter out toward the edges where his shoulders were coming down. And it just looked like, if you want to call it like one of those big Viking things when they wear the armor or something, from the movies. But the muscles in his back were extremely pronounced. His traps, his rhomboids, his shoulders, and he had a super long torso in comparison ratio to his legs. His legs were about 1/3 of the 2/3 of his upper body. Long lats. And what I noticed as I got up closer to him is that it wasn't really hair on the back. If you've seen like a silverback gorilla, the hair is like a short hair on their skin, and it looks like it's like a hair that's there. That wasn't hair, because I saw long stringy hairs too. And those ones were kind of black. The closer I got to him, I could see hair off of his hips, hair off of his thighs, and hair on his bicep, tricep area too, but it was longer and it wasn't as thick. And that was his bicep, tricep is the only area that had any black hair at all. It was a long blackish spot, the full length of his bicep, tricep area. And but that was hair, but it wasn't as thick as the rest of it in his shoulders and stuff. But what was really neat too is, as I was looking at him, that the hair in his shoulders came down to like a widow's peak thing, like to the middle of his back. And I could liken it to like if you see how lions have it, where off of their shoulders it comes down the middle of their spine a little bit. So it came off of his spine and down the middle of his back too. And as I took it all in and was looking at him, when I drove right past him, the closest I was to him was maybe 12 feet. And my truck had a whole bunch of lights on it, cab lights, running boards. And then when I drove past him, I could see the orange on him. So he didn't turn and look at me. I didn't have any eye contact, but I looked right at him. And I was in my truck, and it wasn't a lifted truck. It was still a quad cab diesel with a dually on it. It was driving real slow. But I just looked straight up, and I looked at him. And I could see from his profile, I saw his mouth open a little bit, and I saw the hair off of his like jawline and stuff. And I saw how really big his arms were, even though from a distance they looked like skinny basketball player arms. His arms were just as big around as my thighs, and I've got pretty big legs. If you want to guess, his arms might have been, if you want to think of it, pretty close to maybe 32 inches, because I've got a 35-inch waist now, and his arms were almost about as big around as my waist.
Yeah,
but they were long. Yeah, his arms were Popeye arms. And so right when I drove past him, he didn't look at me. The first thing I said to myself was, oh, shit. Literally, I said, oh, shit. Turn around. Let's see his face. You got to see his face. But as soon as I passed him, I was coming in. As I was going down a little bit in the S-turn, it was coming down to a real shallow, sharp turning S-turn. And I go, you can't turn around here, because the truck had an 8-foot bed and it was a quad cab, and it would have been at least a 5-point turnaround. And I didn't know if he saw me and was going to be aggressive and come after me or what. But I'm like, don't turn here. You're too close. Then I go, well, you can't. I go, I'm a little further now. And I go, well, how about here? And I said, no, the trucks can come flying through here. Well, the weird thing about the geography of that turn right in there is it almost immediately starts to get into what is called the narrows. It gets really, the road narrows. There is no side part on either side of the road, and the rail is right there, and it actually goes up a little bit. So as you're doing it, it's a real fast wiggle back and forth, but it's tight through there. And there's no way nobody can turn around in there. I mean, if maybe a Fiat could do it or something, or a Mini Cooper or something, but you can't do it in that area. It's just too tight and too narrow. So I kept driving, and I'm going, well, turn around. And I'm thinking, well, maybe he's chasing you because he saw you. I was lit up like a Christmas tree. And I'm thinking, well, I had a little, it was a BlackBerry Android phone. It's not Android, but it's a BlackBerry cell phone, and it wasn't on because you don't have reception through there anyhow. And I'm thinking, well, by the time you turn your phone on and you're trying to stay on the road here, there's no way you can turn around and get a picture of him. And I'm driving going, well, how about turning around now? Well, not now. So I kept talking to myself. I was amazed, astounded, and I was a little bit scared too, because it was just so big. I got to a point, it's called Little Jones Creek. It's a left-hand turn that goes off into the mountain, and you actually cross the river off of a little bridge. And I thought, you can turn around here. And I go, no, because you've been driving for, quite a ways now. And if you turn around, you've got to go back. And it's past 1 o'clock. I think if I remember looking at the phone, the dashboard, the clock, then I think it was about 5 minutes after 1. And I'm thinking, nah, don't turn around here. Because by the time you turn around and go back, he might not be there. But then the problem is that if you turn around and he's not on the area where you were, you got to turn around again. And then maybe he will be there. Maybe he's going to look at you and, what do you tell insurance? Bigfoot beat up my truck or something, And so I kind of got myself together and said, well, at least you saw him. And I was trying to just take it all in. So the interesting thing is as I talked with you earlier, the way his steps were, when I watched his foot come up, his foot wasn't gigantic, huge, like over 20 inches, I don't believe. I wear a size 15 shoe, and his foot was bigger than mine, but it was super wide. There was no instep into it like a figure 8 thing, like how our feet are. It was just wide heel all the way down, and I saw the thickness of the pad of his foot, and it was solid. There was no instep. There was no arch. It was just a solid foot. And the same color of his feet was the color of his fingers and the portion of his palm that I saw. And that was like a dark gray, almost black. It wasn't completely black, but I would say it was so dark gray that it was almost black.
And we'll close out the show with John from episode 646, A Hunting Lease. And, John he grew up in Alabama, been a hunter his whole life, and even joined a hunting club. And he said, Wes, there were so many weird things that happened on that property. I just never really knew what it was. And it wasn't until towards the end that he realized what was going on there. Take a listen.
Well, in 1998, I joined a hunting club in South Alabama, and it's private property. We ended up getting a few more leases, and so we ended up with about 2,000 acres of property. And some of the things like we used to put out little 35 millimeter camera film cases, and I used to make little deer scents with doe pee and stuff, and I'd set them out. Well, I've had them stomped. I had one come up and stomp and crush the film canisters, and all I could see was, it was before daylight, all I could see was a big black blob, and I just assumed a deer came in and buck and started stomping the deer scent canisters. But then when I got down later in the morning, and they were mashed almost completely flat, and a couple of them actually had teeth marks in them, but I just passed that off. And then I've had, what I found out later was, these things will parallel you walking in and out. And I've had that happen. And that's kind of weird, because you have them, like everybody says, they match your footsteps. And when you stop, they stop. And I've had that numerous times. And you try to catch them to where you try to stop real quick and still hear one of their footsteps. And their senses must be a heck of a lot better than ours, because they will stop exactly when you stop. And the weird thing is, you hear them close enough in the tree line that you would think that you could see them, because you hear it really close, but yet you don't see them. And that was always a weird thing, that that they sound like they're close enough, whatever it is, that you could see, but you couldn't. And then I had the weird calls. I've had the whoops, and the whoop I thought was a poacher, because back in the day we used to run dogs, hunting dogs, for deer, and then they eliminated that. But I thought it sounded like somebody hunting dogs, walking the dogs through the woods and doing like a little whoop, kind of thing. But it didn't sound. It sounded like nothing I've never heard before. It didn't sound like most of the guys I've ever heard walking the dogs through, calling the dogs through the woods. And then I had the owls, where they do that, the owl mimic, but they don't ever do the ending part. And it's a hell of a lot louder than what comes out of an owl. And I've had the little whistles. A couple times I had what really freaked me out, was I was like, I just couldn't understand it, was they did like a peacock call, and then one of them was in front of me, and they did a peacock call, and then behind me it almost sounded like a kookaburra. And I'm thinking, what in the heck, where are these coming from? And I knew the area. I knew pretty much everybody in the area, and I never heard, I've heard guinea fowl. There was a couple farmers and stuff that had guinea fowl, but not peacocks, and surely not a kookaburra. So I even went, when I go to the feed stores or the hardware store, and we're talking about a little country town, everybody knows everybody, and nobody knew anybody that had peacocks. Then I had an incident where I had white oak acorns lobbed and thrown at me and hit me on a stand. And it was like every minute or so one would come in, and I had a 4x8 sheet of plywood about 28 foot up in a big white oak tree, and I could actually lay down, and I started watching these acorns come in and hit the top of the tree, bounce through the limbs and come down and hit me. And these things were hitting almost the same spot in the top of the tree. And I'm thinking, heck, these things are being precisely thrown. And I watched the trajectory, and they were coming from way, way over the top of the trees, way over down in a hollow. So at first I thought it was, one of my buddies, messing with me. But then when I started seeing the trajectory, I was like, there's no way a human could throw an acorn that accurately like that far. But I still dismissed it. There's a lot of things that I'm like, it just doesn't make sense, and it makes you scratch your head. But you're like, you just pass it off. And a lot of things like that happen all the way up. I guess about 2004 is when I started really like thinking, what is this? One early morning, just at the crack of daylight, and I think this was around 2004. I'm bow hunting on my stand on a little fire break where they clear out a little ditch line to prevent the fires when they do burn-offs, from jumping across. And this was an old fire break, so it was kind of grown up. So I'm on the property line bow hunting, and there's a big pine thicket that I got in front of me. And I'm on the back of our property. There's no way for anybody to come in because the back road, the bridge has been out going across the creek for years. So there's no way for anybody to come in from that direction. And I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden from the back property, I hear it sounds like two people talking. And I'm thinking, who in the hell, pardon my French, is in the back coming, poaching, coming through our property? And they're getting closer, and I can start, making out there's two people, and they're carrying on a conversation, but I can't understand them. And as they get closer, then I can hear them, and it sounded like they had an accent. And to me, it sounded like either they were German or more like a Russian accent. And it was either like a male and a female, or it was a bigger one, big one, or and a littler one. One had a bigger, heavier voice than the other one. And you could tell they were side by side. They were really close to each other because they were, you could hear them. They were really close, and they're walking through this pine thicket, and they're coming closer and closer. Well, then like I said, I make out it sounds like an accent. It's some accent I don't know. But then you can hear them clearly. It's a conversation. And now I'm thinking, wait a minute, who are these people? And where the hell did they come from? And when the wind was coming off my back down basically in front of me into the pine trees. And when these things were coming, they were coming down the center of the hill of this pine thicket. And when they got downwind from me, they just shut up. They just went quiet. And I never could hear footsteps or nothing like that, but they were right there. But as soon as they got downwind from me, they just went quiet. And I heard nothing. And I started freaking out. And that's when I first started thinking, what in the hell's going on here? Who were these people? Where did they come from? And so I went back, when I came back in from the hunt, and asked anybody if, where they were hunting. Because we have to pin out. Everybody has to pin out where, on the map of where they're going to be, so you don't mess each other up. And there wasn't anybody hunting around where I was at. So
what do you think it was, John? What was kind of your feeling? Do you think it was just two people? Or I realize when you're out there, you're hunting, none of this probably makes any sense to you. But
at that time, Bigfoot didn't enter my mind. I couldn't understand who it could have been. I just didn't know. I didn't know where the hell they come from. Who was it? And like I said, they had an accent. It would sound like a Russian accent. I've heard the different recordings that you've had on your show and other shows and stuff, and it was similar to like that chatter, but it wasn't like that. It wasn't like the samurai chatter. It wasn't like, it didn't sound like that. I can try to describe it a little bit. It's going to sound goofy, but it was like, It was like that back and forth. One sounded deeper in voice and one sounded a little bit less, and that was going on through that whole section until they got downwind. And then it was almost like in mid conversation, they just shut up. And at that point, I didn't know where they were at or where they were going. I never thought Sasquatch, Bigfoot. I never thought that. It just didn't make sense. And then I've had the bird whistles going, in front of me, behind me, stuff like that. I've had the wood knock. I only had one other time before a major incident, and it was so far off that I didn't think anything about it. I just figured it was more like, somebody chopping wood or something, But I did hear a wood knock once before. And after realizing that these damn things exist, then I started looking back at all these other weird things. And I was like, oh my God, these things have been around me for all these years. 2006, there was about 10 of us in the club. Well, there are certain years that the deer were just like gone. They would go nocturnal, and we just weren't seeing anything. There'd be like sometimes 2 years in a row where deer were just you just didn't see anything. And so a lot of the guys got tired of not seeing any deer, so they ended up looking around and they found another hunting club further south towards Mississippi line. And so they all joined this other club, but it was a high dollar club, and there was no way in hell I could afford it. So I stayed, and I ended up putting out a little bit more money than normal, and I forked out the money for the whole lease, and I basically was down there by myself from 2006 to 2008 or so, somewhere like that, right in that time frame. And that's when things started escalating, and that's when these things really started messing with me.
Well, tell me about that.
I believe at that time, I think they started thinking that I knew about them way before I actually did. Prior to this, I used to put out deer feeders in the summer to keep the deer, fed and in the area. And normally I put about 600 pounds of corn out every week in just a few feeders. And then some years it would go to, they were eating 1,200 pounds of corn a week. And I believe these things were eating the corn. And so I found some tracks, and at first they looked like, I thought they were bear tracks, partial tracks, but we don't have bear. Particularly back then, we didn't have bear. Now they're starting to move into the state, and there's a few that's been sighted, but it's still rare even now for a bear in Alabama. But I just assumed they were, bear tracks. And then I saw one huge one. And then I was having that being followed, paralleled in and out of the woods. Now I go into the woods on a morning hunt. I leave out at like 4 a.m. and I walk all the way to my stand. I don't drive the 4-wheeler or nothing like that. And I walked out to every hunt on foot. And I had trails going in through the woods to my stand I would cut out. And basically I never used a flashlight unless I absolutely had to. So I was walking in and out and get to my stand and let everything settle down for an hour or so. And I think these things thought that I could see in the dark, and they started coming to where they were getting close to me a number of times. And of course, I believe most of the time I didn't even know they were there. 2006, I normally would not, on an evening hunt, would not get down out of the tree until it was just last minute of light. And then if there was any deer that I heard anywhere around me, I would stay in the stand until they moved out, so I wouldn't spook them and ruin my spot. And then I would climb down and go back to the club. Well, this one particular night, at the time it was a full moon. The moon, of course, wasn't up. It got dark, and I started hearing deer down below me. And then all of a sudden I heard, it sounded, the only way I can describe it is it sounded like a baseball bat beating against a car hood, just a big piece of metal. And it was three hits, bam, 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 down in the bottom to my right, below me. And I was thinking, who in the hell's on our property? Who's poaching? Who's down here? Well, then about a minute later, about 100 feet or so from there, coming closer to in front of me, was 3 wood knocks. And it sounded like a baseball bat up against a telephone pole. And then these, just before the wood knock, the second wood knock, these 2 deer come running from where the first banging was and ran right up to my stand, ran right up to me and like looked up at me and then turned and looked back, and they kept looking back where the noise came from. And I'm like, what the hell? And these deer, I mean, they ran slap up right in front of me. And then the second, the first wood knocks, went 3 knocks, and these 2 deer took off and ran right underneath me and up the hill behind me towards the dirt road. And they hightailed it out. And then about a minute later, probably less than a minute, then the next 3, about 100 feet. And by this time, they're almost like in front of me looking down the hill. And then about every minute, about 100 feet, it'd be 3 more knocks. And then it went like basically like a U shape around me, and they went up the hill to my left and all the way up to where the dirt road was, and then it stopped. And I'm thinking that, and then it hit me. I'm thinking, who the hell could go through? Because down in that bottom, it's like 6 to 8 foot briars. And I've been through there before, and I've had gloves snatched off me. I've lost a hat, and there was no way I was turning around and going back for it because you just get all cut up. And I know how thick it is down in this bottom, and it's down. There's a creek in the bottom, and it's basically swampy in some areas. And I'm thinking, how could somebody walk through there? Because by this time, it's dark 30. It's dark. The moon's not up, so there's no light. There's no ambient light, and there's no way somebody could walk through there without a flashlight. There's just no way, and especially not making any noise. These things did not make any noise. At the time, I thought it was one individual walking, banging on a tree. And when they got up behind me, up on the road, and the banging stopped, that's when it hit me. I was thinking, all right, wait a minute. It's definitely a person, but I don't understand how a person walked up through there. So then I'm thinking, if it's not a person, then what the hell is it? It's definitely not a bear, because a bear doesn't have an opposing thumb. And then I got to thinking, the sound of the knock was the same. And so it was mostly pine trees in that area. There was a few hardwoods, white oak, red oak. And then there was a few scattered cedar trees. To me, it sounded like a baseball bat up against one of them hard cedar trees. It wasn't hitting a pine tree. And I'm thinking, holy crap, whatever it is picking the same type of tree each time and making that same sound, that same loud crack. It's not hitting the soft pine trees. And I'm thinking, wait, so now that they're picking a certain tree, they got a hell of a damn swing. It's louder than any man could hit a telephone pole with a baseball bat. That's the only way I can describe it. It's just like the world's strongest man hitting a telephone pole with a baseball bat. So then I started freaking out. I'm thinking, oh my God, freaking Sasquatch is real, and the damn things are in Alabama. And then it went in reverse. The same area, same tree, basically, is what I thought, going all the way back down to where the initial banging started. Now, the fear factor was ungodly. I've come several times of thinking that I'm going to die, and I've had all kinds of incidents where I thought, okay, this is how it ends. This is how I die. And that fear is way beyond that. It doesn't make sense. But I just remember sitting up there in a tree, and I kept on taking the safety off my rifle because I was like wanting to make sure that I could shoot as quick as I could if I had to. And I was so petrified. The fear, like I said, the fear was just it was ungodly. And at the time, I thought it was one individual walking through there. Later, after doing some research and stuff, I think what happened was there was actually 8 of them, 6 to 8 of them. And the initial one, what they were doing was, I think I screwed up their hunt. And I think that's why they ended up got pissed with me. I think I messed up their hunt, and they were trying to push the deer towards the other ones because they basically had like a U-shaped, boundary. And I messed up their hunt, and I think at that point they were trying to scare me out of there. And I think part of what I know now is I never, whenever they tried to intimidate me, I was definitely intimidated. I was definitely scared, petrified. But I never changed my routine. I never left. I never ran. If I was going to a hunting stand, I went ahead and continued and went to my hunting stand and stayed up in the stand until till way after daylight. The evening hunts, trying to get back, were a lot more, terrifying.
Let me ask you, John, I know it kind of ramped up, and the behavior you're talking about with them chasing the deer or flushing the deer into one direction, I've actually heard that many times, even by people who've had these things on their property and witnessed it firsthand. Now, are you staying in a cabin up there, or are you staying in a trailer on this hunt?
Well, the original homestead is about 120, 150-year-old, I guess you would say cabin shack. And that's where we originally stayed at. But then when we realized, we got permission to, basically we were going to be there a while, then we started fixing it up and we started bringing campers in. So we'd all have our individual campers. So we started bringing a couple campers in. I had mine right behind the clubhouse. Mine was one of the first ones up. And it was just an old, fifth wheel camper that I acquired. So, yeah, so we, a number of us had campers. Like I said, at the time, the other guys pulled out when all this stuff, this is when, when everything ramped up, the other guys pulled out. So I was the only one there. I was the only camper there. We talked earlier, and I never told you a couple of the encounters. One of them, it was bow season. It was the opening of bow season. I had a couple hot spots, a couple spots that were way, way out. I mean, I had to walk, a while to get to them. It was real cloudy, extremely cloudy. There was like no ambient light from the moon or nothing out. The dirt road, I could find my way basically by looking at the ground, and you could see, where the trees on the side of the dirt road or trail or, a lot darker. And then the clay, like the orange clay here in Alabama, the dirt is a little bit lighter color. So I could actually stay in the road by just looking down and seeing the lighter color. Everything else was just black. And you could see the tops of the trees. And on one side, this whole area had been clear cutted, and the pine trees at that time were about, I'd say maybe 4 or 5 foot tall, and they were real thick. They plant them when they go to replant. They plant them real thick, and they get them to a certain height, and then they go in there and start cutting strips out to where they can get more light in between. But these things were real thick, and so I'm walking down the road, and I hear a limb snap in these little pines, and I'm thinking, oh, that's a buck, because it sounded heavy. So I'm thinking, okay, I know the 2 major deer trails, and a lot of time a big buck won't come up the main trail. They'll actually take what I call a secondary trail a little bit further over, and it's less used. But a big buck will usually do that. And the secondary trail was behind me, and the main trail was in front of me. So I thought, well, it may not be a big buck, but it's a deer. So I walked over to the edge of the road where the grass was, and there was probably about 2 or 3 feet of grass, and then the whole line of of all the pine trees started, and it's like a wall basically, or a fence almost of these pine trees. So I got right up to the pine trees, knelt down on my knees, and was sitting on the heels of my boots, and I got my bow and held it in front of me, and I looked down the road, and I thought, well, if this deer comes out, I'm basically going to be lined up with it, and I'll just, put a arrow right through the center of the silhouette. So I'm sitting there, and I didn't mention I had made a homemade ghillie suit. I had a boonie hat with the face mesh sewn into the inside of it. So basically, I was in this. Basically, I looked like a bush. The only thing you could see was my eyes. So I'm squatted down there, knelt down there, and I hear the another limb crack, and it's right beside me, and I couldn't tell whether it was the deer was coming on the main trail or the secondary trail behind me, but it was right beside me. So I'm thinking, okay, it's getting close. It's really close. It's fixing to step out. So I went ahead and went at full draw with the bow, and I'm aiming to that right to the main trail, waiting for this thing to step out. And then all of a sudden, the hair on the back of my neck stands up, and I just had that feeling of imminent doom. And I just said to myself, I said, John, I said, boy, you really screwed up. You just screwed the pooch. And I can't explain why I felt like that, but it just hit me like a wave. And I was thinking, holy crap, what the hell? And then about that time, right behind me, I don't know what I heard, but I turned my head and I looked like to my right, and I was still at full draw. And I'm looking at what I thought was pine needles. I thought it was a pine tree. And I thought, I'm thinking that I didn't think I knelt down that far into the pines, but yet there's a pine tree next to me. And so I turned my head back around, and I started to like release the tension, on the bow to relax. And as I did that, this thing, what I now know is made that huff. At the time, it was so freaking loud. It sounded to me, the only thing I had to compare was, a big buck grunt, but it wasn't that. It was a lot different. It was that big huff, and you could feel it. It was like coming out of an elephant's lungs, but it was just like a huff. But it was like real intimidating sound. So when I spun back around to look at my right again, the pine tree that I thought was right next to me, literally a foot from me, was gone. And then at about the time that I realized that tree that was beside me is not there, I hear the thud across the dirt road by this old fence, in the wood line. I hear a thud, and it sounded like 100-pound sack of corn being tossed onto the ground. And I spun back around to look at that direction, and all I could see was just a black blob going into the trees. And I was just like, holy hell, So I get up and I start walking down the road toward continuing on to my stand. And I just wanted to get up off the ground, get to my stand and get up off the ground. And I'm replaying everything through my head. And I'm thinking, that had to be a huge buck. And I'm thinking, but that wasn't a huge buck. And so I went to my stand, climbed up, got up there, and I was listening for any noise. And the only thing I ever heard was just at daybreak was those little like chirp whistles, like a bird whistle, And I heard one right close to me, and then the next one was further back, and then that's all I heard. So the next encounter was at the opening of gun season, opening day of gun season, and I basically was taking that same trip, going to the same stand. And when I got to what was one of the property lines, because like I said, we had multiple leases and with properties all attached to each other. And there's this huge pine tree that you might be able to wrap your arms around that was right on the property line, and the other property was semi-logged out. They did what we call a partial cut, where they just cut just a few trees. They don't cut everything down. So I would always, when I got to that property line, I would stop and I would stand right next to that pine tree. I would stop, just listen for movement and stuff, and try to see if there's anything around before I continued on. And I stop at that tree, and the hair on the back of my neck stands up. And then I start continuing on, and there's like a little tiny branch, like a little creek that basically you can jump across. And my routine was I'd get down there and make one little jump to the other side and start going up the hill. Well, when I got down there, prior to that, when the hair on the back of my neck stood up, that creek's got a lot of these little frogs and crickets, and stuff. So you hear a lot of those the frogs croaking, And when the hair on the back of my neck stood up, everything, the crickets, the frogs, everything just went silent. And I thought, what the hell? That was kind of weird. And I kind of got an uneasy feeling. So I went ahead and went on down. And just as I jumped to make that quick jump step across the creek, god awful scream comes out at that tree, that big pine tree. And it's like a big ponderosa pine. And the scream is like one of those fox calls, like the fox scream that you hear. A lot of people may not have ever heard it, but it's a fox that does it's just a weird scream. And it was similar to that. That's about as close as anything was this fox scream, but it was extremely loud. Again, you could feel it. And then the other thing was it was about 10 foot off the ground up in this pine tree. As soon as I jumped and it screamed, I knocked the safety off my rifle and I spun around and pointed it. First, I started pointing to the ground because I'm thinking, okay, whatever it is on the ground. But then I realized that it came from 10 foot up off the ground. So I spin around, I point my gun over there, and I'm thinking, what in the hell? And then I just turned around and I calmly walked and got in my stand, climbed up in my stand. And I knocked the safety back off when I got up. And then when it got good daylight and everything, I stayed for a little while. I didn't see anything. And then I went back. And when I got to that spot where that tree was, I got that feeling again. And I went on back to the club and I hunted pretty much the same way for a while, and then they started getting more bolder, and they were coming up and walking, like when I go to and from in the dark, they would parallel me, like I said, those calls, the bird calls, the owls and stuff like that. I pretty much then knew what was going on, because when I was bow hunting, when I came back and looked for tracks right beside where you could see the tips of my boot print in the dirt, and you could see my knee prints in the grass where I squatted, where I knelt down. And right beside to the right of me, all the grass, I would say probably like in a 2-foot spot, was mashed down. Right next to where I was squatted down, the grass was meshed down. I couldn't see any prints or anything. There was no prints in the road, no deer tracks, no nothing. And then across where this thing apparently jumped and leaped across the road, you could see brush where it was pushed. but I couldn't see any definitive tracks or nothing like that. But whatever it was leaped across the whole freaking road, and it was standing beside me.
Let me ask you, John, I mean, this is terrifying. I think most people would probably leave at this point, but I understand not really thinking as Bigfoot, just thinking something bizarre is going on out here. Was there ever a time out there? Two questions. One was, is there ever a time out there where you thought, I'm going to die, or you felt really threatened? And the second part of that question is, did you ever have any deer come up missing after you shot them?
Yes to both questions. Both the bow hunt incident where he was beside me, and also the one at the tree, and particularly the one when I was when they did the knocking where I messed up the hunt. Those three particular ones. It's I still can't explain that feeling, but it's to me, and I've said to like my wife and one of my friends that I finally talked to about it. It's like a primal fear. It's like something. Like I said, there's been times where I thought I was going to die for sure, and it's not anything like that. It's way beyond that, and it doesn't make sense of that type of fear. There was this one house on this other adjoining property. It's not our property. It's an old homestead, and it's about fallen in at this time. And it's a black family that owns the properties, and the younger grandsons would occasionally hunt with us, and it was their property, so they hunted over there. Well, this old house had the front door missing off, and there was a lot of brush and stuff growing up around it, and I would always pass by there. And like I said, it wasn't our property, but I wanted to go in that house and just look at it, see if there's any old stuff or anything, just to see what was in it, what it looked like. So one day, walking to our property to go on a hunt, and it was rifle season. I started to walk to go into that house, and the brush that was covering almost made like a big tunnel going right to the front door. I got about halfway to the door, and I got hit with that feeling where the hair stood up on the back of my neck. And then again, I was like, John, you just screwed up. And I started backing up, and I backed up back to the road. And then I walked backwards and kept looking behind me. And I walked backwards all the way down the road until I couldn't see the house anymore. And then a couple times prior, I was like, man, what the hell was that? And then the next following year, I was driving my truck all the way down through there. So I stopped the truck, got out, and I said, I'm going in that damn house and see what it looks like. I got about halfway to almost the same spot, and it hit me again. And I was like, holy hell. It was just that imminent doom. And I backed up, got my truck, and I never tried to go back in that house again. Now, just a couple years ago, me and my wife were going down to the club. I'm not a member there anymore, but we went down there to shoot our guns. And I ran into one of the older guys, a member there, he's still there. And I feared for his safety because he's an older fella that can't hear and can't see real well. So I just inquisitively asked if he's ever heard or seen anything strange. And he said no. And he said, like Bigfoot? I said, well, yeah, how'd you know? Have you seen anything? No, I hadn't seen anything. He said, but Tommy had told me what you had told him why you quit hunting. And my best bud, Tom, he knows I don't lie. And he said, I know you don't lie, but I can't believe that, So I never talked about it after that. Well, this guy, he said when Tommy told him that, and he believed my story. And so he started doing it, internet searches and started, looking. He said, I believe you. And then I started telling him the story about the house. And I started saying, so I started to walk up to the house. And he said, wait a minute, John. He said, stop. He said, you know Dwayne? I said, yeah. And that's one of the grandsons of the property owner. He said, let me tell you what he said, and then you tell me what you're fixing to say. And I said, okay. He goes, I just talked to him 2 weeks ago. We ran into each other, and he's telling me that he went to walk into that house. He said he got close to the front door, and he said he got screamed at. And I said, are you kidding me? And he said, no. He said, I said, what did he say? He said that a haint screamed at him. And I started laughing. He goes, what's funny? And I said, well, it wasn't no haint. And he goes, what is a haint? And I said, well, that's an old country, saying, and basically it's a spirit, it's a ghost. That's what they call, a ghost is a haint. And I said, oh my God, I said, that was no haint. And he says, you think it was a Bigfoot? And I said, yeah, I know for a fact it's a Bigfoot. I said, because I tried to go in that house twice. I never got screamed at. I said, but I got hit with that feeling of get the hell out of here. So that kind of confirmed that these things might have been using that old house to stay in during the day to sleep. That's just my guess, because the other thing is that house is lined up with most of all my encounters were lined up from ridge to ridge. It seemed like they traveled up and over these ridges, and it was like a line from one side of the property to our other side of our property. And it was always like this one area, and I would say maybe a quarter of a mile wide. And then, like I said, from one side of our property to the other. And that's where most of all my encounters and anything that's ever happened has been in.
Merry Christmas, everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to the show. If you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com.